Try with the slides I'm actually going to use.
Huh?
You want me to try with the slides that I will actually use?
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, go ahead and load it. This is already recording, so you don't have to touch it. Just the microphone's here.
Yeah, that's great.
Everything's working.
When do you start?
I'm actually, I suppose I'm waiting for Larry Taylor, but I start at 6:30.
Okay.
So I was told.
I'm really early.
I was told to be here 15 minutes before, but the friends where I'm staying actually, without me knowing, moved to Croton on Hudson. I was thinking it was going to be just around the corner, but no. So I actually came much earlier and walked around.
Yeah, that's quite a change.
I missed the whole of Manhattan. I'm not a suburban guy. I'm not a dog guy.
Where are you from?
I'm from Italy.
Oh, so that's the accent.
Yeah. Despite my 20 years in London, yes, that's the accent.
Well, I hear the London accent.
Yeah, well, compared to the kind of accent that we get here, but yes.
Yeah.
No, Italian. Italian.
You're
expat,
Italian.
yeah.
Well, good.
Do you work here or you just...
No, I just, I moved here from Los Angeles. I'm originally from here. I went to City College. Unfortunately, long time ago. But I got the emails about the center, and it has some interesting, for me, presentations.
I must say I went through the list and I felt a bit in awe, because I mean there were quite some quality speakers on the the last couple of weeks. And,
and unfortunately I missed them.
Yeah. I was really
but I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
I must say, on the plane I was freaking out a bit. But,
can I ask what your background is?
Well, I went back to academia after 7 years as a kind of a banker or salesman, stuff like this. But I work in development studies, so all my degrees, other than undergrad, which was in finance, they are in development studies, which is something that here I'm not sure how much it exists. It's kind of a former colonial.
It used to exist here when I went to college, but I don't know about now.
So, no, primarily I work on borders and migration. So, the department teaches all the courses I teach in the department relate to globalization, relate to, of course, borders and development.
Are you a geographer?
No, although this, I mean, my long-standing research was on Afghan refugees in Pakistan. And when I tried to make sense a little bit of borders is when I started getting into geography. And I must say, just caught my attention. And I thought a lot of the things that are really interesting right now in the social science.
Exactly, are from geographers, which is really fascinating because they don't have the same preconceived notions.
No, exactly.
That economists, for instance, have.
Plus, in a sense, all of the social sciences, in humanities perhaps is different, but all of the social sciences have moved on to notions of space, connectivity, and geographers have been working since the late 70s at the very least, or in a critical way since the late 70s at the very least. So I found it difficult at the beginning to grasp some of the notions such as scale, space, and things like this. But I found it very useful, basically. So effectively, when I finished my PhD, I began another private PhD on borders from a geography perspective, and this is where I'm kind of working.
I'll be eager to hear.
Yeah, I will see how it goes. So,
what you have to
thanks
say.
so
Yes.
much. Yes, thank you.
Yes. And how do you pull Marxism into this?
Well, in many ways, in the sense that I think that real radical contributions to geography stem from those early texts of Niels, David Harvey, Lefebvre, Lorraine Massey, and in a sense there is, our department is very much concerned with political economy, so it's very much concerned with the way in which capitalism relates to development and the development process and inequality and all this. And so I am very interested from that perspective. I'm also, though, interested in adding some components. I don't know if you know, I think they're running it here as well. There's a conference called Historical Materialism, which has been lately very much about thinking about ways in which class, globalization and capitalism kind of intersect, how to think of political action.
Well, that's a great direction.
Hi, how are you? Nice to meet you. Hi, hello.
I see you're all set up.
Yeah, I mean, I've already copied the slides, I'm all done.
Excellent.
I was told this is recording.
Yes, so I'm going to have you sign this,
Yes.
which says that you allow
Sure.
yourself to be recorded. And then you can tell anyone who inquires also that there'll be a link on the website to the recording so that you'll be immortalized. Yes. Hello, this is Anne. Unfortunately, I have to leave. I can't stay for your talk. Anne's going to stay for a little while just to make sure that everything goes all right. And if you would like, she will also introduce you on behalf of the center. It's up to you. It's a formal.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much.
And I think, you know, you still have some, probably 10 or 15 minutes before.
No, indeed. I mean, I was trying, I mean, since this, I don't think it's going to be
Yeah.
lots of people, I was trying
12
to,
minutes or so, yeah.
maybe if I could sit here.
I heard you say that these sessions are recorded.
Yes.
I was working on a couple of sessions, but I didn't get a chance to come here. Can you tell me where I can see that recording?
If you go, right now our website is not the easiest thing to do. Yeah. So right now, we're going to be changing it, but right now, if you go to the main page of the website and you click on About, which is on the, or is it About? It is About. If you click on About, there'll be a drop-down menu, and if you click on About in that drop-down menu, at the below where it talks about what the center is, it says you can view previous events at this link.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and those are the last several events that we live streamed here.
Yeah.
Before that, we weren't able to record all events, but some of the much earlier events are also under events, if you click on events.
Okay.
So the more recent ones are at that strange, obscure place. Older ones are...
Benissimo.
Tutto bene?
Benissimo,
Sono venuto a
Non ti
sentirti.
aspettavo.
Guarda che io non aspettavo di vedere, ho guardato ogni tanto, visto che...
Ma tu sei qui appunto?
Adesso sì, sono venuto 2 o 3 mesi, ho finalmente trovato un contrattino per un anno, e sono molto contento, però devo tornare in Italia a cambiare visto.
Non lo puoi fare qua, no?
No, perché il visto che devo fare, infatti torno lunedì, però insomma, volevo anche scriverti un'email per dirti guarda che vengo, però non sapevo se c'ero o non c'ero, quindi
Ma sì, tranquillo, no, io tra l'altro pensavo di passarmi, sono venuto in largo anticipo, sono arrivato martedì e stavo da degli amici che fino a poco fa stavano a 30 blocks da qua, e io pensavo ma sparo 3-4 giorni a Manhattan e me la scialo. E invece arrivo e ho scoperto che vivono a cazzo di Croton.
è lontano, dici?
A un'ora di treno, cioè sei fuori dalla City.
Io non ho adesso mia sorella che sta qua vicino,
Capito.
però sono contento, ma fino a quando è che stai qua?
Domani fatto, perché
Domani
c'ho anche
fatto.
tante altre conferenze, vado a sud, sostanzialmente vado all'Albuquerque prima, c'è l'Association of Borderland Studies, e poi vado a Tampa, dove c'è il Geographers.
Ok, e quindi stai
Ho
facendo...
fatto proprio il grand tour degli Stati Uniti, sono molto
una
contento,
cosa
infatti
bella.
me la voglio scialare, infatti,
Io
tranquillo.
infatti, guarda, ho visto che presentavi tu la scorsa settimana, ho visto anche Alfredo Soffilo che è venuto.
È venuto qua?
Sì, era no qua, però era su un'altra, perché l'ho visto, guarda, pubblicizzato, ma
ci
perché veramente poco. Qua era stato fatto, almeno l'avevo visto, l'ho scoperto Alfredo.
Sono andato giù e ho detto apposta, senti, devo venire a un talk, non mi ricordo la stanza, no? Dove fa, che talk è? Dice, uno sui border. Guarda, penso dopo 10 minuti, ho detto, guarda, se mi ricordo bene era tipo 92 something. Something about Marxism.
Sì, sono io.
Ok, go.
No, però e come vanno le cose a SOAS? Bene?
Si è finito il secondo trimestre che è il killer.
Sono tutti intesi adesso?
E quindi basta, tranquillo. Infatti io ho proprio finito abbastanza sott'acqua. Stanamente non ce la si fa più. E però bene, sono solite robe, solito
Ho visto ogni tanto, vedo le manifestazioni, le demonstration che fanno.
No, c'è tante cose going on. Cioè ci siamo noi con
Fractional.
Ci sono i fractional, ci sono i democratized SOAS,
I cleaners anche ho
i
visto.
cleaners, cazzo pompa.
Io continuo a guardare perché comunque l'anno che ho passato ieri mi sono divertito, a parte però è una bellissima università. Infatti ho detto devo cogliere il volo, l'opportunità. Non sapevo neanche quando partire perché mi hanno dato il via veramente martedì.
Ma che c'è di insegnamento?
No, io sto facendo. Lavorerò con qua è presente l'ufficio ACLI che qua è considerata una ONG e quindi lavorerò qui con loro tramite Labor, praticamente aiuto ai lavoratori italiani per i visti no vabbè insomma cerco di rimanere un po'. Ma guarda sì perché è stato ti dico la situazione di lavoro la sai anche tu com'è in Europa e ho lavorato un po' a Roma e poi i contratti vanno e vengono e le cose sono molto difficili. Adesso sono contento perché alla fine ho un contratto per lo meno di un anno. Uno lì, vabbè, ce l'ho e sono in una bella città e sono veramente felice. Ci ho provato anche tanto a Londra però.
Costissima, perché poi anche se trovi qualcosa la mano si possono affittare le case.
No, infatti guarda, io ero stato a marzo l'anno scorso da iniziare.
No, nel senso che ero stato nel San Francesco.
Io ho scoperto che la gente anche le cose più veramente infatti è una cosa bella anche se vai poi da solo le conferenze concerti, qualsiasi evento sempre via è una cosa positiva e la prima volta
non pervenuto dal punto di vista accademico.
no, poi vabbè qua io lo tengo sotto l'occhio perché è il centro di Asia
Infatti io ho detto cazzo vengo proprio Anna del Leone.
Infatti deve essere veramente io guarda le cose che non ho ancora lasciato posso guardare i siti dove so che posso leggere le cose che mi piacciono quindi guardo sempre alcuni che penso
Adesso tu c'è un ragazzo
sì ma adesso veramente
si chiama appunto non so se è ufficiale la sua si chiama Paolo Santos anche se in realtà si chiama Leo però
sì ho capito
non so se è ufficiale però insomma da settembre guarda anzi costano
non lo so io ho anche una gola di continuare a studiare però ultimamente quello che riuscivo a fare è devo riprodurmi economicamente adesso non so fare quello molto difficile io posso continuare a guardare tante volte
ciao così cioè
ho visto le cazzate che è bello tutti arrabbiati comunque stai
sì cioè scrivi un'email
così con una tensione brutta interessante così che si trasforma
fare un po' di documenti in Italia. Tu parti domani,
Io continuo sempre a fare i contatti, sì. Tanto sono qua. Sì, sì.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Just checking.
We're not going to make you stand.
Yeah, no, good.
well get started. To not waste your precious Friday night minutes. I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight and welcome Paulo Novak, who's going to do a lecture today on borders, Marxist territories, and post-colonial terrains. I want to welcome him on behalf of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics, and I think this is a really good fit for the center in terms of talking about space and also about Marxist and post-colonial theory. So I think it'll prove to be a very interesting lecture. Just a little bit about Paulo. He's a lecturer in development studies at SOAS, the University of London. His research is concerned with the relationship between borders and the development process at large. It is located at the intersection of critical globalization, migration, and development studies. He's particularly interested in exploring the definitional boundaries of development's analytical units and the tensions between state and non-state centered units of analysis and representation. His articles on borders, refugees, NGOs, imperialism appear in journals across the field of social sciences. So I'd like to, if you could join me in welcoming Paulo Novak to
Thank you, Anne. Thank you to Mary and the Center, but especially thank to all of you for coming here. I mean, in London, if I were to attempt to get somebody to listen to me on Friday night at this time, I could only head to the pub. And and it's pretty unusual for me to see the amount of people that I see here at this time of the day on Friday. So many thanks for this. And I mean, the paper that I want to present today, it's actually a paper that in its original version was presented at the Historical Materials Conference in London last November. And it's a paper, part of a collective project that was kind of originated as a reaction to Vivek Chibber's book, The Spectre of Postcolonialism, which I'm not sure how many people are familiar, but basically amongst the various celebrations, reactions, and contestations of the book, myself and other colleagues in SOAS and in other universities in the UK decided to set up two panels at that conference that were trying to look for points of contact and articulation between Marxism and post-colonialism. So, I mean, from that perspective, my intervention is fairly limited in the sense that I don't engage with Marxism and post-colonialism as epistemological projects in themselves, but I try to look at how Marxist and post-colonial geographers see and study and approach the study of borders and territory. So this is not a very big field, and it's a field that relates to what in Europe at least is called the Renaissance of border studies, which is where most of my current research actually unfolds. And just give a pointer. I mean, I wasn't sure who was actually coming to this talk, so I'm gonna name names just to see if there are some points of intersection that we can perhaps explore later in questions and answers. But I mean, I see as three foundational texts of this border studies field the work of Anssi Pasi, Finnish geographer, concerned with looking at borders as dynamic social processes that spread across society. The work of Etienne Balibar, who is a political scientist, who actually looks at what he, I think, calls the three dimensions of borders: their over-determination, their polysemy, and their ubiquity. And indeed, a third founding text that I personally think it's the founding text, and it's Gloria Anzaldua's La Frontera. In the field of border studies in Europe, actually, the reference to the same kind of approach is made to Willem van Schendel and Abraham's Itti, but I think actually it is Anzaldua who is really, in a sense, the founder of the border studies field. So, I mean, I enter into both of these fields, I mean, the fairly limited project related to Marxist and post-colonial approaches to border studies and the broader field of border studies through my long-term interest in the Duran line, which these images attempt to capture from this different perspective. And I thought, just as a way of introducing the context in which my talk will unfold, and perhaps as a way of sketching the argument from the very beginning, I thought I should start from there, from the Duran line, a line that I studied primarily during my field research in Pakistan, where my interest was more oriented towards Afghan refugees and the regime of protection and assistance for Afghan refugees. But I mean, the Duran line is basically the line that separates or unites, or the point of contact, let's say, between Afghanistan and Pakistan. It was a line that was demarcated by a treaty of in 1919, the Rawalpindi Treaty, and it was delineated as part of the so-called Great Game in Central Asia, which saw the British and Russian Empire facing each other, and their kind of mutual interest in constituting a buffer state, Afghanistan. So, as a consequence, I mean, of course I'm simplifying, but as a consequence of that agreement, a whole series of processes of demarcation, or what Isfahani calls processes of creating roots and anti-roots, began and became part and parcel, if not constitutive element of the Great Game in Central Asia. So the Duran line has, from that moment, a crucial significance vis-a-vis pretty much everything that goes there in the area. The line is in itself contested. The treaty supposedly only had a 100-year term, so very soon is going to expire, or so at least some would argue. And the main reason is that the line cuts across populations that live, well, in both sides of the borders. I'm sure, even just by the news, the term Pashtun, or the Pashtun tribes, the kin-based groups that live across the areas, have been indeed, from the very beginning, or from those times, caught up in the global designs of these imperial powers. And that was so at the times of British India, it was so during the Cold War, and it's certainly definitely so in the current context of the war on terror. So I mean, the line is in itself very interesting from many perspectives, but I mean, amongst the many things that I think are useful, or that line is useful to think about, one thing has always captivated me, and it was briefly mentioned during Anne's introduction. I mean, that tension that Anne was referring to between the state-centered jurisdictions that it defines and the anything but state-centered social life that unfolds across it. And in a sense, I mean, I want to start from there, from that contradiction between the absolute relevance of the Duran line for, again, for anything that happens across the area, and its absolute insignificance at the same time. What do I mean by that? I mean, absolute relevance, I mean that precisely because that line defines two separate jurisdictions, has been the battleground for many of these imperial projects. And again, this was at the time of British India, where the so-called three Anglo-Afghan wars were precisely about asserting authority in areas across the Duran line. It was so during the Cold War, when Mujahideen were paid mile by mile, effectively every mile conquered or taken away from Soviet influence was effectively paid in cash. And as I said, more recently in the famous battles of Bora Bora in 2002, again, it has always been a crucial line of demarcation over which intense battles, global battles, have been played out. But I think it has other kinds of significance, and the significance stems precisely from its demarcation of separate jurisdictions. So if you look at Afghan refugees, for example, well, it is only because of the existence of the Duran line that Afghans in Pakistan could be considered refugees. A lot of the Afghans who left for the very same reasons that refugees did, but actually never managed to cross the border, were considered IDPs, internally displaced persons, which had immense consequences for their protection, for the kind of assistance they would receive from the so-called international community, and so on and so forth. NGOs who want to operate in either side of the Duran line, well, they need to ask permission to the respective government, the government of Afghanistan, the government of Pakistan. They have to comply with the regulations that well, that regulate the operations of non-governmental organizations. Smuggling is premised on the existence of different tax jurisdictions, and so on and so forth. At the same time, I would say that the same kind of processes and forces that make the Duran line absolutely significant are the forces that actually undermine its significance. So if on one side the Duran line is a crucial line of distinction between jurisdictions, well, that line seems to be very easily transgressed, very easily crossed. The term porosity fits nowhere better than across the more than 2,000 kilometers of the Duran line. So this is again the case. Well, I can go through all of the same examples in the context of British India, when, well, British soldiers were pursuing, in actually a hot pursuit, Afghans across the border. It was so during the Cold War, where NGOs, even if they were based in Pakistan, were engaged in cross-border solidarity activities with Mujahideen villages inside Afghanistan. It was so for refugees themselves, who, despite being recognized as refugees and benefiting from, well, effectively at the height in 1985, it was almost $1 million a day in assistance activities. Well, they were the first one to go back and forth across the Duran line, either to fight jihad or to, well, cultivate crops in their own villages, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, in a sense, that has always captivated me. What makes such line so fascinating, to my mind at least, is it's been both absolutely crucial for everything that happens, for understanding anything that happens there, and absolutely irrelevant for the way in which things that happen there seem to unfold. And I mean, again, as a way to sketch that argument that I'm going to propose today, is to think about the Duran line as attentions, or borders more in general as attention. And in a sense, borders are the quintessential state-centered institutions, yet the social conditions that allow for their emergence, their continuation and resilience, and their transformations seem to escape any state-centered definition. They are produced by multiscalar social processes, and once defined and demarcated, they also generate multiscalar social processes. So both in relation to where they are, the exact location of the Duran line, and in relation to what they do, it seemed to me that borders are in a dialectical relation with a multiplicity of force relations that go well beyond the state-centered cartography that they define. And it's in relation to this conceptualization of borders that I engage in, as I said, in much more limited way with Marxist and postcolonial geographers' understanding and uses of borders and approaches to borders. And my argument in that respect is that both of these geographers are primarily concerned with what borders do in relation to primarily capitalist or accumulation and the extraction of surplus value, or in relation to the production of knowledge and Eurocentrism. Well, I think that if we look at what borders are, i.e. how borders are produced, where are they demarcated, what explains their existence, resilience, and transformations, we can perhaps find point of contact and articulation between these two traditions. So how do I get to this argument? Well, I will briefly introduce the notions of territory and terrain, which frame, in a sense, the talk today. I will perhaps even more briefly, not to again waste your precious Friday night, discuss how I understand Marxist and postcolonial geographers' approaches to border studies, to borders and territory, and then I will return to the Duran line to try and hone in the point. So, territory and terrain. Well, for the purposes of this talk, I try to work the notions of territory and terrain on the basis of three authors. The first one is, well, Robert Sachs in his book from 1989, Human Territoriality, John Agnew and his concerns with the territorial trap, and Stuart Eldon, whose recent book, The Birth of Territory, has been very much at the center of debates in the area. In fact, he's concerned, in fact, I take the word terrain from the work of Stuart Eldon, and the word territory from the work of Robert Sachs. While I use John Agnew to kind of escape the territorially based or state-centered ways in which I describe. So, in a nutshell, I mean, the notion of territory refers to the way in which borders constitute territories by establishing a linear inscription in space that defines an inside and an outside. An inside and an outside that has some meanings for different people, for different processes, such as the one that I described before. And an inside and an outside that is also complicit with the regulation, or at least the attempt at regulating movement across such line. So borders are an attempt, effectively, to establish control over people and places by including and excluding, by differentiating, by distinguishing between here and there, between us and them, between jurisdictions, in a sense. And I use this notion of territory, which is in fact much broader, but I use it specifically to think about the national territory, about the sovereign, quote-unquote, jurisdictions that borders define in territorial terms. So I refer to territory precisely to the spatial extent of the state, if you wish, of sovereign jurisdictions. I use the notion of terrain instead to account for what Stuart Eldon calls the social qualities of territory. In other words, by thinking about the variety of social relations, social formations, and subjective experiences that are cut across by the linear inscription of borders, and each of which possesses its own sense of inclusion, exclusion, its own sense of connectivity, and so on. Perhaps as a way of very briefly trying to descriptively present these notions. I mean, by territory, I refer to this, to that abstract, if you wish, understanding of sovereign jurisdictions, to the fact that where the line is effectively defines where Afghanistan ends and begins. Afghanistan as a territorial entity. And by terrain, I refer to a whole series of social qualities, again using the work of Stuart Eldon, such as, well, in premise, the type of populations that are there. I mentioned the Pashtuns or the various kin-based social formations that, in fact, not only across the Durand line, but across all of Afghanistan, seem to possess their own geographies that certainly do not neatly fit within the linear separation established by the Durand line in itself. I also think, or certainly when we think about the social qualities of territories, we should think about the topography of the area and how that shapes forms of circulation, the relation between sedentarism and nomadism in history, or indeed forms of livelihood, of which poppy production certainly has been one of the major ones in many parts of Afghanistan. But again, I'm thinking about trade and the circulation of commodities, of food, and so on and so forth. So the first notion is abstract, as I said, and Robert Sachs talks about territory as entities created by borders, and in fact as abstract spaces. This is a red line or a red area that is supposed to convey a whole series of meanings for all of us. The second notion is it's certainly more experiential, it's one based on lived experiences, on actual livelihoods. And it's concerned very much with how the inside and outside and the type of connectivity or lack of connectivity that the Durand line or Afghanistan borders attempt to project is experienced. Whether the attempt of Afghanistan borders to mold social life along state-centered dimensions or scales is actually successful vis-à-vis the whole variety of social relations that cut across it. And I think, the two notions are relevant here in two ways. One, because in my mind at least, they allow me to make sense of the original, of the contradiction and the tension with which I started. And it is only, in fact, because of the existence of the Durand line that things like refugee protection can take place. It is because migration laws are premised on the linear inscription that defines refugees, or that distinguishes perhaps refugees from IDPs, that makes the government of Pakistan a sovereign actor, and certainly the government under whose jurisdictions Afghans are, that this takes place. It is only because of tax differentials or different tariffs that smuggling can take place. So territory is relevant, and that abstract linear inscription is absolutely crucial for, again, understanding processes such as migration, smuggling, or, I mean, certainly in other contexts, I should perhaps talk about labor and labor laws and labor legislation, how that is taken advantage of. The other notion, the notion of terrain, again, it tells me how that abstract territory needs to be set in relation to these various social relations and how they unfold with their own geographies, how they intersect the abstract territory, define that line. So I try to associate territory and terrain to that tension with which I started this talk. The second reason why I think these notions are relevant is because they can somehow, and here I'm happy to engage in a discussion, but certainly can be associated to the various epistemological traditions, to Marxism and postcolonial approaches to the study of borders, something to which I now turn. So if I were, to think about how Marxist geographers think about borders or use borders to pursue their own projects, I would say that effectively the key aspect in their analysis is to see borders and territory as functional to the reproduction of capital. The main concern of Marxist geographers is, in a sense, to de-fetishize space and to focus on the social relations of capitalism that actively produce space. And a process of production that is at the service of accumulation processes. Space, scales, and territories are not a given, but rather are produced by capitalist social relations. They contribute to the constitution of so-called combined and uneven geographies of development, of capitalist development. And I think, in a sense, these are what the founding contributions of Marxist geographers tell us. So for Henry Lefebvre, uneven development is not a historical accident, but an integral component to the accumulation process, the very hallmark of the geography of capitalism. The secret to capital success, and I quote, lies in its ability to construct material geographies that facilitate the extraction and realization of surplus value during the accumulation process. Neil Smith, again, sees uneven development geographies as the result of the opposed tendencies inherent in capital towards the differentiation but simultaneous equalization of the levels and conditions of production. Capital, and again I quote, not only produces space in general, but it produces the real spatial scales that give uneven development its coherence. David Harvey, which I feel in awe at that site in here, or talking about in here, well, again, these geographies are the expression of an opposition between countervailing forces, making for geographical concentration or the dispersal in the circulation of capital. This unevenness provides spatial fixes that resolve the contradiction between the contradictory unit between movement and fixity. Similarly, Doreen Massey talks about uneven geographies, although she frames them more in relation to the organization of production on capitalist lines. So the point is that all of these authors, the founding text that I see the founding text of Marxist geography, are primarily concerned with the way in which combined and uneven development shapes space, how space is functional to the accumulation process. And in a sense, I want to interrogate what does that mean for borders. None of them specifically dealt with the issue of borders. David Harvey certainly to a certain extent, but in a sense, if I were to look at contemporary Marxist geographers that are very much concerned with borders and territory specifically, I would say that in premise, what this means for the study of borders is acknowledging their functionality in the production and reproduction of such combined and uneven geographies. So the territories defined by borders are not containers of social life, neither they are a reflection of society, but rather they are more fundamentally imbricated in the constitution and functioning of a capitalist society. The meaning and significance of borders lies in their systemic nature. effectively in their over-determination, to use Etienne Balibar's notion, in the definition of a system of fragmented political states. And again, perhaps I should compare, or I don't know if you can see better. So by over-determination, I mean that the territory of Afghanistan or Afghanistan borders are not relevant in and on themselves, but really as part of a system, an interstate system in which capitalist geographies of combined and uneven development unfold. So borders are pivotal to accumulation as they define the fundamental scale, or one of the fundamental scales for the reproduction of such geographies, the national scale. They reproduce the separation between politics and economics, and thus allow the simultaneous existence of a global economy in the context of fragmented political units, two dimensions of a single but contradictory political economy system. I mean, James Anderson, which is a geographer at Queen's University in the UK, talks about or unfolds this way of thinking about borders and territories to talk about what he calls the new imperialism, premised on the management of a global economy in a context of fragmented political units. So the geographical and uneven spread of capitalist development is sustained by borders through the definition of national territory and apparently sovereign and apparently autonomous jurisdiction, which function as the territorial basis for a wide range of institutional, legal, and regulatory practices that are and institutions that are premised on such distinction. This can be seen perhaps in three ways, just to give a bit more concreteness to this talk. First, the linear spatial inscription of borders, i.e. the definition of their various national jurisdictions, function as regulators and stabilizers of global patterns of accumulation. They provide an outside that solves the problem of accumulation through spatial fixes. The peculiar characteristics, if you accept that term, of borders, in other words, the differences in terms of tax and labor legislation across countries, favor the global circulation of capital. Indeed, in most developing countries, but in that I would include Europe under Angela Merkel, I mean, the idea that we or states need to adapt to the imperatives of the global economy effectively depoliticizes the global economy in and on itself. It puts the global economy outside the realm of national political accountability or democratic accountability. Second, borders are managed to foster capital, to foster accumulation. They can be open for capital and closed for labor. They can be used to foster bouts of accumulation by dispossession. They can be decomposed and recomposed. In other words, the institutional management of borders constitutes or creates new spaces of accumulation. And this is something, I mean, all the policies associated to neoliberalism, again, especially in developing countries, but not only, are related to that. And I'm thinking about the constitution of special economic zones, which effectively are territories within the national territory that possess particular meanings. Territories where tax and labor laws are suspended for favoring and fostering accumulation. I'm thinking about regional free trade agreements. I'm thinking about the South African Spatial Development Initiatives, the Greater Mekong region. In a sense, I can think about NAFTA and so on and so forth, Europe or the EU, etc., etc. So the reconfiguration of borders, that active management of borders, the opening and closing and the relocation of their functions is done at the service of global capital as a way of creating new territories and increasing or decreasing the relevance of old ones. So it's not only about this map, but it's about the active management of these lines to create new spaces of accumulation. The third, and certainly from the perspective of border studies in Europe, the more interesting analytically way in which borders again foster and facilitate accumulation is by thinking about their role and functions vis-a-vis migrant labor, or labor more in general. Indeed, borders facilitate the control and create divisions within the world labor force. They are functional to social control in national context and to the reproduction of labor, but they're also very much at the heart of the regulation of migrant labor on a global scale. They impose restriction on the access, on the judicial status, and on the movement of people. And indeed, they make much more vulnerable several categories of workers. Borders dispossess migrant labor, so much so that some would argue that borders perform a third freedom of labor, not only free from subsistence, not only free to sell his or her labor time in exchange for a wage, the migrant is also free from rights as it crosses the border. Perhaps some categories of migrants are so, not all of them, but certainly it's a way of capturing the extent to which the territorial functions, the regulation of movement across borders, function as a way of cheapening labor, as a way of dispossessing labor of rights. So in sum, and again, without spending much more time in this, I think that Marxist approaches to the study of borders and territory expose the role of borders and their functionality to accumulation, to the international division of labor, and or to imperialism. Marxist approaches are primarily concerned with what borders do as regulators and stabilizers of global patterns of accumulation and the production of geographies of combined and uneven development. So the significance of borders is to be found in their definition of territories at the service of capital and in their functionality vis-à-vis the regulation of movement across them. Postcolonial geographers that are concerned with borders and territories, it seems to me that are also very much concerned with what borders do. Although what they do from their perspective relates pretty much or primarily to the production of knowledge and to effectively, the process of knowledge production. So from this perspective, the rigid and static understanding of territorial jurisdictions, such as the one depicted here, used by Marxist approaches, is most often rejected, as this represents a Eurocentric understanding of world history, or indeed, as people like Walter Mignolo says, a condition of epistemic colonialism. Indeed, many of such geographers would argue that the analytical privilege given to class analysis, to the extraction of surplus value, and to the ceaseless accumulation of capital at a world scale should be questioned. And indeed, subaltern or alternative perspectives, the fluidity of identities, the hybridity of forms of imperial rule should take center stage. The field perhaps is a bit more scant than the previous one, and it's also more diverse, perhaps reflecting the more general field of postcolonial studies. But in a sense, I would say that you can identify, or two positions or two main concerns can be identified. The first one relates to this Westphalian cartography, if you wish, which is very much seen as a Eurocentric epistemic imposition, in the sense that it defines history primarily in relation to Europe. The diffusionist discourse, whereby borders and capitalist modernity is spread from the center and progressively incorporates the rest of the world, well, it's very much at the heart of the grudges of people like Walter Mignolo, Arturo Escobar, although he's not so much concerned with borders, but certainly with territories. Indeed, this diffusionist model is read as a way in which the West represents the rest of the world to itself. It is complicit to a process of othering. Indeed, as put by Dipesh Chakrabarty, Europe works as a silent referent in which third world historians feel a need to refer to works in European history, but historians in Europe do not feel any need to reciprocate. They, quote unquote, produce their work in relative ignorance of non-Western history. And this does not seem to affect the quality of their work. So the concern here, in a sense, is with the systematic suppression of subordinated or subaltern cultures, with the systematic suppression of the temporalities with which different cultures and knowledges enter into modernity, or certainly enter into this cartography. And again, perhaps the main concern from this perspective is to emphasize knowledge that is embodied, that comes from below. I mean, one of the key issues here is that the disembodied and unlocated neutrality and objectivity of knowledge is, according to this position, a colonial myth. By hiding, in a sense, again, if I think about this map, by hiding the location of the subject of enunciation, European colonial expansion and domination constructs a hierarchy of superior and inferior knowledge, and therefore of superior and inferior people around the world. Eurocentric understanding of space projected by borders are seen as a conceptual grid. Here is the work of Ron and Shamir, a grid that is resisted and transgressed by social actors, yet with many difficulties. I mean, certainly, although he emphasizes the subaltern perspective, or certainly the marginal perspective of those who are able to transgress this grid, I mean, the key concern is with the epistemic community that continuously refers to such Westphalian cartography. You find the work of people like Jennifer Hinman, who argues for an embodied geopolitics, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that non-Western ways of knowing, understanding, and practicing political resistance should be incorporated, if not altogether privileged, in our analysis. Indeed, the second perspective, or second concern, which is strictly related to this, refers to post-colonial approaches questioning the rigid understanding of inclusion and exclusion, like the rigid understanding of territory, if you wish, that borders define. They would emphasize instead how territories and political identities defined by them are not static, but rather vibrant social entities that possess specific social attributes, whose meaning, rather than to be found in their global and structuring force, needs to be uncovered contextually, needs to be found here rather than in their systemic value, if you wish, in the policing, in the heterogeneous experience, in the heterogeneous understandings that these people have of their existence, and indeed their stories as seen from their perspective. Because this is what would contribute to a decolonial form of knowledge production that highlights how borders are experienced, how alternative geographies of space and place traverse the territories defined by borders. So, again, more specifically in relation to borders, the key concern here seems to be about going past a binary vision of inside and outside, a linear historical account of incorporation, and about bringing to the fore translocality, hybridity, and this is where the work of Gloria and Zaldúa comes to the fore, and pluri-connections. So some of the geographers here would see borders as a fiction and emphasize the connections, of translocal connections established by histories of migration, or the hybridity of identities that originate from them. Others simply privilege or assert the relevance of social networks as the defining scale for understanding contemporary processes. The work of Jo Sharp, again another geographer in the UK, is actually much more concerned with post-colonial understandings of power relation, and her work is primarily concerned within the field of geopolitics, primarily concerned with researching and exposing positions that are resistant or alternative to the border-centered understanding of space, and that occupy a position of marginality, in a sense. Indeed, and I quote, studying only the dominant accounts and those that absolutely oppose them can have the effect of reifying the binary distinctions created at borders, or binary understandings of territories and identities. Rather, we should focus our analysis on geographical representations that are neither fully inside nor fully outside. So again, this is a photo that represents one of the two official crossing points between Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's a place called Spin Boldak, and it's on the Quetta-Kandahar line. I mean, the other main pass is the one that goes Kabul, Jalalabad, and Peshawar. This is on the south-western parts of Afghanistan. So the idea, or my idea of putting this photo here, is precisely to emphasize how this border, this line that I, for one, start asserting its relevance, it's actually experience. It's actually constantly transgressed. I mean, every year I show this to my students, and I start by asking, what do you think is the border? I mean, this is the border. We can see flags, we can see fences, we can see police ballas, but it's not even clear if we are in Afghanistan or in Pakistan. It's not clear exactly where the border is. It's not clear what goes on in here, and certainly that sense of rigid and linear inclusion and exclusion seem to be, well, taken over by the exuberance of such place, or the social life of these people. So in a sense, if I were to sum up this position, I would say that a common concern is with a situated methodology that transcends, that avoids transcendent analytical positions and methodological perspectivalism. The political economy of capital, labor and the state, or the politics associated to rescaling are indeed important components of globalization, but their force does not operate up there, at this scale. Rather needs to be uncovered in its grounded and situated implications, and indeed heterogeneous implications. So the meaning of borders is not to be found at the global level, on the abstractions of globalization, but rather in borders' everyday life, and in borders' existence as represented descriptively in this photo. So what to make of this? And I'm heading towards the conclusion, and I'm sorry if I had to go through this various positions. Well, the first point that I want to make is that perhaps I stereotyped a bit of the two positions, and although almost every sentence or every assertion that I made is taken from the work of some author or the other, in reality a lot of geographers are working in ways that attempt to incorporate each other's critique. I mean, on one side, of course, there is the critique or the emphasis on difference versus universality, and this, I mean, and that is, I mean, various geographers have worked at the intersection between these two positions. Indeed, the most interesting work is precisely that work that attempts to incorporate both sides of the story, if you wish. However, in a sense, they, coming from each other's perspective, they maintain a certain degree of analytical hierarchy in the definition of units, of processes, in the way in which the verticality or the horizontality of scale works. So on one side you have the work of geographers that start from the universality and the globality of accumulation, but incorporate difference as a mediation or as a mediated reality. What distinguishes this image from this one is just a series of layers of mediation that render this concrete, although they would not budge from the fact that this is the most relevant realm for political action in contemporary world. On the other side, you have postcolonial geographers, Ramon Gros-Fogel, for instance, who attempts to frame an anti-capitalist politics that starts from questioning the rigid distinctions between inside and outside. So, in other words, there are works, there is the whole so-called topographical approach that was rendered famous recently by the book of Sandro Mezzadra and Brett Nilsson, Border as Method, which again attempts to think about labor and labor processes from a post-colonial perspective, although it's not very clear in what sense they do so, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, in a sense, I recognize that the two positions that I attempted to distinguish may not be so clear-cut, and that a lot of interesting work is done in ways that attempt to bridge these two positions. On the other hand, I would say that effectively in this debate and these attempts at incorporation are symptomatic of wider debate within the social sciences that effectively attempt, each of them attempt to establish an analytical hierarchy, a starting point, asserting the most relevant scale for the study of globalization and contemporary capitalism. Indeed, while both of these positions seem to conceive borders as an imposition, whether in relation to well, to capitalist accumulation or to knowledge production. I mean, on one side, what is emphasized is the overdetermination and the structuring nature of borders is privileged analytically. On the other, privilege is attributed to their embodied situational and transgressive experience of state-centered cartography. So, what is more important, the universal and the abstract, explaining how structures of domination work through and because of borders, or the fragment and the embodied, which explain how border significance can be subverted or is indeed subverted. Or more specifically, in relation to the Duran line, I mean, what are the most relevant analytical units that I should use to make sense of processes such as refugee migration or indeed refugee assistance, such as trade and smuggling and so on and so forth. How to account effectively for the relation between these two images. I mean, it seems to me that these two positions somehow frame the debate in oppositional terms. It's about competing perspectives, each attempting to establish their own analytical hierarchies vis-à-vis the relevance of social processes. And so it becomes a matter of intellectual and political faith more than anything else. It's a debate that is framed in terms of competing perspectives rather than complementary. I would argue instead that if we study the border itself, the line, where it is located, and what is significance in relation to the territories that they define is, well, perhaps we can try to understand or we can try to find points of contact, ways in which territory and terrain are not really competing concepts, but are two sides of the same coin. And I want, again, very briefly to conclude this, to engage with this argument from two perspectives. First, by thinking about where the border is, where the actual line of inclusion and exclusion that I, for one, started saying that is absolutely crucial is, and later by thinking about how it is significant in this context. So both of these positions, and indeed the majority of border scholars, would tend to think about borders as an imposition that stems from European expansion, colonialism, and inter-imperial rivalry. However, if you see about exactly where the border is demarcated, well, each of these single lines actually has a significance that goes well beyond the, in a sense, the inter-imperial context that decisively shaped and structured the context in which the Duran line is formed. I mean, there were debates. This is a map that represents, or the two lines that I drew over that map. It's a map from 1908. Well, these represent the kind of political debates that was going on in Westminster, party political debate that was going on in Westminster in London about where the demarcation between India and Afghanistan should be. And so you had competing interests. You had those who favored the expansion, I mean, those who favored effectively the constitution of routes that facilitated commerce, which were or having positions that very different from the generals or the administrators that were very much concerned with how to defend British India or the gates towards British India from both the tribes in this population and potentially from the Russian Empire. There were contestations effectively over where the line should be within empire itself. It was not a unidirectional imperial logic that defined the Duran line. Colonial administrators had a much more pressing concern, which, sorry, I don't think you can see this, which was dealing with this tribe. This is the Afridi tribe, in a period very similar to that at the beginning of the last century. And the Afridi are a crucial tribe because ever since the arrival of the British, they have been put in charge of the Khyber Pass, the other crucial official crossing point between Afghanistan and Pakistan. In fact, to my knowledge, even during my field research in 2002, they were getting paid, I'm not sure by whom, but they were getting paid to maintain a line of connectivity between Pakistan and Afghanistan. there were situations, and I mean, I did some study, both archival and then through secondary resources, that were, I mean, effectively once Sir Mortimer Durand went and tried to find out exact points where to demarcate, well, he was summoning villages or village chiefs to discuss where the line should be drawn, and 400 men would appear claiming that nobody was representing them and that the almighty British Empire needed to negotiate with each and every one of them. This little band over here, it's the result of the Turi, which was a Shia tribe, request for protection of the British Empire, which they thought would help them deal with the Sunni tribes around the area. So my point is that every single bend, turn, and twist of the Durand line actually has very much a multiscalar significance. Is of course very much shaped by the structuring context of inter-imperial rivalry, but is very much negotiated as a matter of party political discussion. It's negotiated with, well, each of these single individuals all along the line. And I mean, this is something that also other borders with Africa, I looked at the work of James Griffith, who looks at the Ghana-Benin border, which again, in the treaty it is acknowledged that the border would, even if it should follow the parallel, it would go around the particular villages who promised allegiance to one or the other colonial empire. And of course, I'm not saying that these people are as analytically relevant for the study of empire as the Great Game and in the European empire's confrontation in Central Asia. What I'm saying is that the borders is not a zero-sum game, it's not a unidirectional imposition, but actually is produced by a whole series of contestations over the meaning of space from very different perspectives, from the perspective of empire, from the perspective of colonial administration, from the perspective of each of the people living in the territory to be. So it's the product of a contestation over space that defines where the Durand line is. The inclusion, the abstract territorial inclusion and exclusion performed by the Durand line, well, seem to be in itself a process of contestation over inclusion and exclusion. Clearly the result of inequalities, the inequalities of that social terrain. And in a sense, the same point can be made in relation to smuggling. Again, I try to understand the territorial significance of the Durand line in contemporary terms, so trying to address the point that I was making at the beginning. Again, here it seems that an unequal distribution of power and resources between all the various social actors involved in smuggling is at the heart of the territorial significance of the Durand line. And so, on one side, the Durand line distinguishes between tax jurisdictions. So, the AFCA Trade and Transit Agreement, just to give an example, is a bilateral agreement between Afghanistan and Pakistan that is premised on UN-sanctioned principles that allow landlocked countries such as Afghanistan to import any sort of commodities or agreed commodities via the closest port, which in this case is Karachi, free of duty. In other words, Toyota Corollas can be imported via Karachi into Pakistan, into Afghanistan, without having to pay Pakistan import duties. So the premise, the inclusion and exclusion performed by the Durand line clearly defines these two jurisdictions. Of course, the social terrain and the social geographies that over which the Durand line unfold, well, mean that once those Toyota Corollas arrive in Afghanistan, in most cases return to Pakistan and are smuggled back into Pakistan. It's not only Toyota Corollas, it's appliances, it's all sorts of commodities that are being imported through ATA. My point is that this distinction that is clearly visible here, well, it's actually constantly transgressed for all sorts of purposes. On one side, the territorial distinction performed here is absolutely crucial. The territory, the abstract territory defined by the Durand line, is the basis upon which refugee migration, smuggling, trade and trafficking can take place. On the other side, it is the social terrain that makes those activities possible in the first place. So again, I don't want to assert that the petty smuggler that engages in petty commodity smuggling across the Duran line, or the mafia boss, or the corrupt policeman, or indeed the Swiss banks that certainly will benefit from all of this, are to be put on the same plane. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is precisely the contrary, that by looking at that tension, by looking at how the abstract territory allows for certain things to happen, and to see how these things happen in their actuality, both in the previous example vis-à-vis the demarcation, and in this example in relation to smuggling, well, we can actually better capture the inequalities across the social terrain that is here. So borders are not a linear inscription of space whose meaning and significance we can decide or attribute a priori or on the basis of particular epistemological perspectives. Rather, they seem to me they are a dynamic process of contestation over the meaning of space. And it is that contestation, in a sense, that is where I want to end. So I return to this photo to think about the various perspectives, to think about what Marxist geographer, or what I read about Marxist geographer would suggest to look at. And in a sense, I think what they would suggest me to look at is, well, is what is not there, is the abstract, is the power of, well, of US imperialism, as somebody called them, that shapes what is going on in that area. Is the US Marine from Ohio that I met in Islamabad during his R&R, rest and recreation. Well, it's the power of the various Afghan armies, the power of capital that structurally shape the conditions of these peoples. Well, if I were to follow the other perspective, well, I should start thinking about the reasons why all these people are here, where these people are going, what are the livelihoods and experiences of the border. So, in a sense, these two different positions attempt to assert and attribute meanings to the Duran line, each from their own perspective. My argument has been instead that by looking at the border as a site of contestation over the meaning of space, place, and connectivity, well, we can capture the structure, but also very fluid social terrain in which all of this unfolds. It is about bringing together the way in which US Marine, Swiss banks, and the local mafia dealer somehow interact with these people that allows us to capture the significance of the Duran line. Indeed, it is the inequalities associated to that process of negotiation and contestation over the meaning of the Duran line that somehow brings to the fore these inequalities across different social actors without attributing a priori a relevance to one or the other process. So if you conceive the border as a tension, as a contestation over the meanings of space, then I think these unequal distributions of power that are reproduced by the border come to the fore much more clearly. It's not really a choice between abstract territory and social terrain, but rather capturing the extent to which these abstract territories, defined by borders, contribute to the reproduction of inequalities across the variety of social terrains that I described. And I'm going to end it here. Thanks. With age, I have problems with my side. And of course, I'll be happy to take any question, but yes, please.
So from the other, thank you very much. It was really extremely interesting. And important. But if you, I'm Susan Buck-Morris, I'm here at the Grant.
Thank you.
If you, I mean, the two approaches that you're saying are in fact, when the two are brought together, the most interesting work actually takes place. The two approaches have a rather strong, therefore, or consequence for the political implications of the analysis.
Indeed.
On the one hand, you have to deal with capital, labor, class, and these categories. And on the other, you deal with cultural difference, epistemological inequalities, etc. So there are consequences, there are therefores that come out, or politics in both cases. And what I couldn't see clearly, or even, couldn't even guess, as a matter of fact, couldn't guess, is what the political consequences were. You know, what if we are also politically concerned? What we should make of your fine analysis, which is indeed concrete and much less mythical than the other two.
Well, it's the question, and I mean, I started by mentioning the historical materialism conference, and I mean, I thought that a lot of the big discussions going on there were somehow related to how do we understand class today, and these competing perspectives were, again, precisely about emphasizing how, I mean, I tend to distinguish between these positions in terms of two terms, again, of how class permeates everything or how class is articulated with everything. I mean, the two positions certainly have different political implications. And in a sense, you're right. I mean, I kind of hide away that from this because it's perhaps a topic bigger than myself. What I've been trying to do here is to, first of all, bring to center stage inequalities. Inequalities between apparently incommensurable social actors, which I do not see as incommensurable, but actually see as negotiating their own existence and reproduction around borders. And these actors are global, are patriarchal, are class-based, but they're also very much fluid, local, embodied. So my concern is to try to bring within the same framework the way in which these these various social actors actually simultaneously are in somehow a topographical way in unequal positions of power or possess unequal distributions, and the way in which borders contribute or not to the reproduction of such inequality. I kind of identify maybe two positions. I mean, one is, again, one that would insist on the global side, on the structuring forces, and it would be a position that effectively it's much more concerned with the exposure of the significance of global processes and the abstract to these people. And of course, this is a very peculiar context, and perhaps these discussions are more related to political contexts that I know, i.e. the European one. Another position that also has a lot of premise is a position that is premised on translation, the possibilities of translating these different claims in terms of an anti-capitalist struggle, if you wish, and vice versa. What does it mean, an anti-capitalist struggle, or how could we translate anti-capitalist positions in a language that, that could be significant to these people? I don't have a solution. I mean, I would say that the solution must be contextual, and I would say that the most important thing is the realization that being able to cut across these various social spaces is in itself a position of immense power. In fact, I mean, the only real conclusion of all of this is that those who, like me, like I assume most of us, are able to capture the significance of capitalism and imperialism in this context and capture the significance of this context for the reproduction of capitalism are the ones in the better position. So whether we should do or have the agency or the trusteeship to do that, it's another matter. I would certainly think about much more local ways of engaging with these demands. I'm probably hiding away again, I'm not sure. Yes, please.
Yeah, kind of to follow up on that, I know you're not engaging this debate with Chipper, but I wish I missed his talk. It would have been great to have both of you there.
Well,
but I mean, he's arguing incompatibility of these two theoretically for a politics of liberation.
Yes.
And in your presentation, I don't know if you were citing Escobar. Chibber really goes after, but I don't know what Postcolonialist, but you state that the analytical privileging of concepts of accumulation and class should be questioned. I mean, for the Postcolonialists, that's so much Western imperialism, just another form of that.
In fact, I was presenting their position.
And so, and that's what Chibber critiques about Postcolonialism, and argues that a political practice guided by Marxism is qualitatively different, and it needs to engage those concepts if we're going to have an effective liberatory politics. So where do you come down? I know you're just trying to, but I wasn't really clear what your argument, which is a really important theoretically, politically.
My argument, I suppose, is that I think much better analytical insights can be garnered by looking at the limits of those structuring forces rather than their overarching extent and their structuring force. I'm interested, if you wish, at where the rule of capital ceases to exist and the rule of these people actually takes place. In fact, it might have made its way through the abstract. I mean, I think about incompleteness as a form of rule in and on itself. It's not so much that difference needs to be explained, but it seems to me that one of the ways in which these structuring forces are reproduced is precisely by being able to be different, to maintain the same force, but operate differently in different contexts, if you wish. So I see that as a tension. Again, a tension that for one, I'm not sure if I should resolve, but certainly I see a tension that brings about, interesting analytical questions, and I think it brings about a much more grounded understanding of those structuring forces. So for once, I would try to think about US imperialism or capital intersects or is able to incorporate the difference or the fragment in and on itself. So, I mean, I for one don't want to think about any form of political action that does not take into consideration that global and overarching structure. But also I feel very uncomfortable in asserting the primacy of that when I have to talk to these people or when I did talk to these people. And I think the more we're able to understand what exactly are their claims, I think the more we can understand about new political subjects. I mean, because that seems to me the key question at stake. Who is the political subject, or how do we think about the political subject in our contemporary world? Certainly, I would not see the political subject only in relation to capital, class, and surplus extraction. Yeah.
But then what?
Yeah, right.
No, but even anecdotally, what did you get from your field research that gave you some glimmers of some surprises, something you didn't know as someone who knows the Marxist literature on global capital or neo-imperialism?
To me, I mean, what I wanted to communicate and the biggest discovery from my perspective is that difference is not something that pertains to the local, but it seemed to me, and certainly in my work on refugees I try to demonstrate that, it seemed to me something that actually allows forms of domination to take place. So we should think about that difference, whether you think, and that's why I talked about either translation or about activism, if you wish, of a particular kind. That, I mean, I'm not certainly here to answer that, but the recognition of difference as a form of rule, I think it seems to me one of the most interesting aspects of my study on refugees, effectively, and on borders. It's not that difference, we need to explain difference, but difference is the starting point. And that's why I'm skeptical about top-down narratives that explain our conditions of domination. I would start trying and understand, and that's why I want to end it up here. I wanted to end it up with this photo, which is to understand how these structures of domination are constructed from the ground up. Because it is then, and then if we agree in the way in which they are constructed, then we can think about political action. But if we don't agree on that, well, then we can continue discussing who is the most appropriate political subject. From my point is to try and think about how hierarchies are constructed out of difference, rather than thinking about top-down and levels of mediation. In a sense, I think that in this way, you better capture the social actors rather than the broad social processes that should be our referent for political action. And again, not surprisingly, I mentioned Swiss banks because they are present everywhere. They are present there, they are present in the overdetermination. So it's not about capturing the structuring force of capital or class or the colonial imposition of a Westphalian cartography. I think it's about identifying the social actors that make this, that are reproduced through that cartography, through accumulation and surplus extraction. Then, if we agree who are the actors and who are we and what is our relation to all of this, then we can for sure devise the most appropriate way of framing political action.
Just one other, you didn't mention religion, you mentioned Pashtun, you mentioned tribes.
Yes.
But religion was totally out except for your example of the Shiite-Sunni distinction. So that's interesting.
Well, I mean, I would use it to, effectively I would frame it in terms of those alternative forms of knowledge, or certainly alternative geographies, or non-state-centered geographies that are reproduced in discourse and action, that put in place certain specific individuals, specific authorities who have a long historical trajectory, who in turn allow for the reproduction of patriarchy, for the reproduction of capital, for the reproduction of imperialism. So, I mean, again, certainly one could start making the wholesale discussion starting from the relevance of religious authority or religion in shaping inclusion and exclusion and lines of connectivity. I started from borders and the state-centered cartography, but one could go the other way around. My interest coming from this side would be to see how these authorities and these social geographies, rather than being oppositional to the state-centered cartography, are in fact able to reproduce themselves through borders. So, I mean, again, I suppose my central point is not to see about these forces as in opposition to each other, but rather see how the abstract territory of the border is actually complicit in the reproduction of all these forces and in the reproduction of concrete individuals in their position of power. Yes, please.
Yeah, so what is, now that you're sort of
coming out,
No, I like the way you sort of finished that, right? That you sort of kind of synthesize that. Yeah. So what is your sort of engagement with, for example, the work of Frederick Cooper? There's some elements there, right? In terms of what you know, the sort of the process of empires being differentiation, inclusion, exclusion. These things are not one or the other within an imperial framework, right? And what is also your engagement with who also engages Marxism, where sometimes she says she comes out of the communist sort of background within India, right? So, but she's going somewhere else, you know, in terms of her own engagement with some of these things. So I'm trying to get an idea of how you work through that, right?
Yes, look, Frederick Cooper, yes, I like him. I mean that a lot, and in fact has been a source of inspiration. My work on refugees, on what I call in other work the institutional incompleteness of empire, is inspired by Cooper's notion or Cooper's suggestion to look at the limits of rule as a much more significant analytical dimension. So fully indebted to that way of thinking about forms of domination. the work of Spivak I'm far less familiar, I mean, other than in anecdotal terms, so yeah. But certainly Cooper has been throughout, and I mean, again, my location, and it was mentioned by Anne, is a Department of Development Studies, where the study of Africa has been crucial, where ever since my master we've been fed with Frederick Cooper, so yes, certainly one of the foundational texts here, even if not mentioned directly. But, yeah. Yes, please.
How do the people in the picture, in other words, the actors who are actually being acted upon by different forces, did you engage with them? Did you, in the field research, how do they perceive what's happening? In other words, do they see that they're playing a role in history, or do they feel as if they've been swept out of history?
Look, I think they perceive the situation both with a lot of stereotypes and with an immensity of depth that I could not have imagined. Pretty much, perhaps, like we do. We work on stereotypes and we have depth of knowledge on things that may not. So in a sense, not much different from the way in which each of us think about that context. And I talk about stereotypes in the way in which historical elements, or in the way in which processes or countries or nations are stereotyped over history, and in their histories and narratives, and in their positioning in the world, and so on and so forth. But also an incredible depth in the sense of a very profound knowledge of European history. I mean, the British were there 500 years ago, and I think they are much better known. The British are much better known to them than vice versa. And so there is always, or my impression was that there was always, again, if you have references to James Scott, a public transcript and a hidden transcript, in the sense that it was only through time that I was able to get through well, even to the way in which I was perceived, which was both premised on stereotype and on a profound knowledge of what people like me would want. So, I mean, very much in the way in which we talk in most of our articles, or certainly newspapers, about them as a people, I mean, they have the same perception of us. We are, or I was treated as a peculiar person on the basis of my color, on my way of walking, on my way of dressing, but there was certainly much more curiosity on their part to know who I actually was. So there was much more awareness of what is behind the formal realm of interaction. So I don't think there is a sense of them being an agent of history, but I think there was a sense of history being on their side, if only because of the control over territory, over those particular territories, and the fact that a lot of foreigners have come and gone, and they have all concurred to the reproduction of those authorities, those religious sects and forms of authority that are still there. In fact, that in many cases were initiated under British colonial rule.
But it's also the question about how people can channel what they think and what they feel about it. I'm thinking about the case of Ukraine and this referendum in Crimea that they held, Russia. When people were asked what they actually want, which border where they want to draw the border, so and they expressed their opinion, and then but we know that somehow it was all forced because it was going against the international laws and so on and so forth. So it's, I mean, the question is it really possible actually to get this knowledge, that you were talking about, what that, people who live in the territory or terrain, I don't know, because Crimea, I don't know what is what is this now, territory or terrain? So is it really possible to know this, to obtain this knowledge? And what's the political instruments for that?
Well, I mean, in a sense, you're pushing me to make two, I would say, implicit arguments of this talk. The first is in praise of field research. I mean, I think you can only, and again, returning to your point, I think I can only make sense of the force of capital and imperialism by being there, much more than by reading any text, because I was able to grasp how that force is articulated or how it permeates. We can discuss that, but certainly is overwhelmingly present in what are considered its margins. In fact, how it is sustained by this context. So the first implicit argument of this talk is an argument in favor of field research, in favor of a theorization that starts from the concrete and goes to the abstract, rather than the other way around. I want to capture the relevance and significance of the abstract territory and of the interstate system from the ground up, rather than the other way around. And the second implicit argument is that those who really are good at it, i.e. the social actors that really are able to draw the most out of borders and abstract territories, are those actors that are able to both produce and define borders and transgress them at the same time, are those who are able to concur to the definition of where the Duran line is, whether it's open for capital and closed for labor, whether it should be functionally relocated somewhere else, and are able to do whatever they want because they are powerful actors. So I think I see this as a good way of identifying which social actors and their relative position to each other are those who most benefit from the existence of the Duran line as such. Thank you. Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Sure. You mentioned that you talked about a little bit about the new board that's melted.
Yes.
Do you know it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's really good.
Yes.
But you didn't talk about how.
The point on translation. Thank you very much. Thanks so much. Bye bye.
Anyway, Aicha Chibukchu, is she working with you?
Excuse me?
Aicha Chibukchu, she's now working.
Françoise?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, not too much. I think she's in the.
No, she isn't. But I mean, she's a theorist in a sense, but an anthropologist, and she would be. She would like to feel work and a Marxist. So. Okay. Anyway, but a former student of mine.
Okay.
Anyway, it was
look
really, it was very,
much.
very interesting. Although you're distressingly still a political scientist, and that's. I mean, you know, so it's the analytical model which can be Marxist or not, you know, and there's something there that.
And in a sense, to me, I mean, my point is really, I don't want to be either define myself. I don't care. I mean, to me, it's really about how we identify.
Right.
That to me is what matters for thinking about political action.
No, it was extremely interesting and well done.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
So I'm just kind of curious as how you see that book, because it seems like that book is somewhat making a similar argument.
Yes.
But are you?
Yes.
So I just want to see, but their focus seems to be on like how this kind of border, the proliferation of borders, have intensified labor.
Yes.
Are you saying like, well, that's kind of privileging?
Look, I've also just finished a study group on that.
It's such a difficult book.
It's such a difficult book.
It's so
I think that
which one?
Border as Method.
Oh yeah, heard of it.
It's really.
I think it's a great book.
It's
in
a
fact,
great
I like
synthesis.
the work of Sandro Zadra. In all honesty, I prefer other stuff that he's written.
I haven't read the other stuff.
I think if I were to differentiate, I mean, I draw a lot of inspiration from Sandro Mezzadra and indeed from the Farsanito network and from the Calcutta Research Group, which are concurrent to the definition of many of the arguments there. And so I have been for the last 10 years inspired by that work. If I were to differentiate myself, I would think about first their epistemological concern. They have what I perceive as not much of an interest in defining what a border is, and much more concerned with the functioning of borders and the functional reorganization of borders. And the second point, and then we can discuss this ideally over a beer because I'm really thirsty. I think there is a big empirical deficit in that book, which...
What do you mean, like?
I mean that I mean where I ended. I think...
You're saying that their theoretical formulation is not based on fieldwork?
I don't know what it's based on, but the way in which they frame the book. I mean, at times I feel that if you start from here, not everything they say neatly fits into each other. So I think that the book has some empirical deficits in the sense that although they make continuous references to various work that is concerned with what they do, thanks so much. I personally would have benefited from seeing how all the different processes that they talk relate to either one context or the global scale. But I mean, look, these are the points that came out of the discussion in the study. I'm not sure if you agree. I mean, what do you think about these points? Or?
I feel like that book was drawing from these kind of different ethnographies. Right? They're drawing from these kind of different ethnographies to make this kind of theoretical formulation. So I'm not sure in terms of like empirical deficit.
Empirical deficit, it's a term that I just used and was mentioned by one of the people in the study group, and it came out in relation to the chapter on figures of labor.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a person who had been working with them, with Sandro, for a long time, an Italian guy who did a very good job on the city of Naples and migrant labor in Naples. And he was manifesting a series of doubts. And by empirical deficit, not that, oh, it's not sustained, but empirical deficit is, I think he referred to the fact that it is not clear exactly how this multiplication of labor work. It would have benefited greatly from a bit more concreteness. Then from my right, so that, because it's a bit too much in the air, and that is what I personally think. So much so that I don't think it holds very well together. I mean, I think that the bit on geography, the first two chapters, questionable in the sense of the selectiveness of the source geographical references that they use. I think all the chapters, like figures of labor, chemical space is just genius, no? But the Farsanito network, in which that idea of borders as a temporal device, it comes from there. Genius, right? Just.
I was impressed by that.
That's it. I mean, that's so full stop. That respectful stuff. Again, from this perspective, one should perhaps think about different temporalities.
Well, that's kind of
yeah. It was an interesting study.
So you're in development studies?
Yes.
So you're a PhD in? You teach?
Yeah, I teach there.
Okay, so. Because, I noticed you're going to be at the political geography pre-conference. Yeah, I'm happy to go there. I'm studying political science, although I did a master's in geography. So.
Okay. You'll be getting this, but with less references to the Duran line, which is probably better.
Yeah.
Like in 20 minutes, which is probably better.
Right. I just noticed today that you're on that, and I'm like, well, I could just wait till then.
You could have waited
20 minutes, but
or you can make
here I had a
the
little
same
more time to
questions.
reflect.
I will
But now,
be better prepared.
yeah. Well, hopefully in the interim, I'll have a chance to read at least that one article that I came across.
Yeah.
Yeah, but really
that's
interesting
his
stuff.
In fact,
I'm sorry I missed the beginning because I was at that talk that Shiver gave at.
So was it today?
You mean, yeah, he is giving a talk today at NYU, but I thought you were referring to the historical materialism conference.
November.
In New York.
In London.
Oh, there was one in London. He was
He was also in London. He was everywhere. I mean.
Right.
He was also the historical materialism in Delhi. That's why at the beginning of this talk I started talking about various celebrations and contestations of the cheapest book. Yes.
But was there an incident like there was, or a non-incident like there was in New York where he basically decided not to respond to Chatterjee's critique of his?
No.
Okay. So was there a discussion?
I saw the video. No. I know that it was okay. I mean, also by then he was already. I mean, he had gone through Delhi where the argument was maybe not fully taken on board.
Yeah.
I don't look. I try to stay away from this. Very often seen in academia to me.
Yeah.
I think he has some good points. I think he overlooks, from my perspective, certain things. That's it. I mean, I wouldn't spend 2 years talking about that book personally.
Yeah.
Like, in fact, any book.
Right.
But that's me. So I like, and again, I didn't read it intensely as the book we were talking about now, but I'm much more interested in trying to figure out
nice to meet you.
Latest.
Dan. And
so I'll see you in Tampa, right?
Yeah,
I understand. Good. Yeah, great. Okay. Thank you. See you soon. Bye.
I wanted to ask you, I'm not sure if you were referring to this in the end, but given the most Marxists in the world now, for the global south,
yes.
how is it possible to have Marxist analysis and a postcolonial analysis?
I think so. In fact, oh yes. In fact, this is I think the most interesting bit.
That's what you were referring to.
And again, that maybe I should take this away, but I was referring to that at the end. I was also perhaps having a go, and in fact I started by talking about the limited field I engage with, in other words, what in Europe is called the Renaissance of Border Studies, which I'm the first one to say is 30 years centric. It doesn't take into consideration, let alone Italians, or I mean there has been Italian, so again, I asked Mary, I said, what kind of audience will it be? She didn't want to tell me one thing, so I wasn't sure. That's why I was dropping names here and there to see. But yes, absolutely. And I'm not sure which, if I refer in particular to. Yes. There was, again,
to try break another binary, right?
This was a very interesting paper I went to this conference that was asking, is there a Latin American Marxism? And again, it was pissed off with North American Marxists who define what Marxism is, and then, then you have the Italian Marxism, the Latin American Marxism. As he said, but look, especially in the context of Marxism, is it? Why do we continue? So I mean, yes, epistemic coloniality, usually involving white male academics, is the problem. But that's why I have to engage with these things. But my concern is to understand how these things are reproduced in my context via borders. But these are it's those actual inequalities. In my opinion, we should be focusing on whether cheaper is completely right or completely wrong. I mean, just It doesn't make sense to me. I'm sorry to be.
Oh, it's interesting.
Yeah. Like so. Yeah. So slow.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Remember that investor in the elevator was like they're stopping at the police station now or something, and all the families were like, what is this? Yeah, and I felt really bad because I was like, damn it, I didn't follow about it first. I was like, no.